The Monterey Public Library welcomes you to Building Belonging in a Time of Othering. Today's program is part of Book to Action 2021, a grant-funded program of the California Library Association, supported in whole or in part by the U.S. Institute of Museum and Library Services under the provisions of the Library Services and Technology Act, administered in California by the state librarian. Book to Action initiatives tackle important issues in the community and encourage reading, community discussion, and action, focusing on this year's themes of equity, health, and sustainability. Across California, there are 110 participating library locations, 36 unique Book to Action initiatives, and 35 California library jurisdictions. Monterey Public Library selected Cast, The Origins of Our Discontents by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Isabel Wilkerson for this summer's Book to Action and Adult Summer Reading Program. Cast reveals the many ways race is a social construct and invites us to discover the inner workings of an American hierarchy that goes far beyond the confines of race, class, or gender. A book steeped in empathy and insight, Cast explores through layered analysis and stories of real people, the structure of an unspoken system of human ranking, and reveals how our lives are still restricted by what divided us centuries ago. We invite and welcome you to join the Book to Action Community Read. Weekly book discussions continue through July 24th. Monterey Public Library has hard copy and ebook and audio books available to check out for free to your best personal technology devices, including your smartphone, iPad, laptop, and more. Staff are available to assist you. We also thank Whites for Racial Equity, our local Showing Up for Racial Justice chapter, for coordinating these book discussions, specifically Elaine Gehrman and J.T. Mason. We also thank Juliana Robbins and Holly McChris with the California Center for the Book, a program of the California Library Association, and Jody Thomas with the California State Library. Thank you to the Othering and Belonging Institute for their support in providing today's program. We also thank the Community Foundation for Monterey County for their support and partnership, as well as numerous local organizations who have signed on to be ally organizations. Thank you to the Book to Action Steering Committee, Elaine Gehrman, Laura Lee Alexander, J.T. Mason, and Leslie Simon. Now it is our pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce John A. Powell, Director of the Othering and Belonging Institute and Professor of Law, African American, and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He was previously the Executive Director at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University, and prior to that, the founder and director of the Institute for Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. John formerly served as the National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union. He is a co-founder of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and serves on the boards of several national and international organizations. John led the development of an opportunity-based model that connects affordable housing to education, health, healthcare, and employment, and is well known for his work developing the frameworks of targeted universalism and othering and belonging to effect equity-based interventions. John has taught at numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia University. His latest book is Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other. Professor Powell, thank you so much for sharing your afternoon with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Francesca. So it's a delight to be here. What Francesca didn't say, she's a friend of mine, which is one of the main reasons I'm doing this, although I think the work you're doing down in Monterey with the library and the council is quite important. I have my plan is to show you a brief PowerPoint. I may not get through all of it, and I was looking at it earlier and I couldn't get the video to play. So what I will make the PowerPoint available, and hopefully you can look at the video. I will tell you, you can look at it as Bridging Animated. If you type that in the URL, it'll come up. Again, I'm here at the request of the Monterey Library and others who are supporting this effort. And like I said, I'll take about 15 minutes just to give you some introduction to the concept of belonging, and then have a conversation. And I think we'll have a short time for you to have some breakout. So one of the ways to sort of think about what's happening, not just in California or the United States, but the world, is that we're in a process of deep othering. And in fact, on the play of W.B. Du Bois, we could say that othering is the issue of the 21st century, and it's a global phenomenon. And it may actually usher in the end of the nation state as well as the planet as we know it. This is the video, and I don't think it'll show, but no, it's not showing. So hopefully you can look at it later. But the video is basically explains why this process is happening at such a global level now. It also suggests and there's a graph that I'll come to shortly, which also captures much of the same information. But it suggests that this is not going to end anytime soon. This is not one election cycle. It's not Democrats versus Republican. That there's some profound phenomenon that's happening in the world that will continue to happen, that will create tensions around us and them. And of course, the idea of them is in some ways a social phenomenon. It's not a biological phenomenon. So this is basically suggesting that the way we other people can be along any particular axis: race, sexuality, gender, how many cows you have, as in Rwanda. There's no natural others, which is one of the myths that we believe, that someone's of a different race or a different ethnicity, they're different than us. And yes, they're different than us, but it's not relevant until we make it relevant. So there's no natural othering, but we have a very robust social process that makes othering seem natural. And each society has a dominant way of othering people. So in some societies it will be race, in other societies it'll be religion. Francesca mentioned Isabel Wilkinson's book. In some cases it'll be caste. And it moves and it changes over time because it's socially constructed. And so it's not just othering that's happening. Othering is being weaponized. That is, it's being used by certain groups to actually challenge our very containers, our very foundations, to attack trust in institutions and government, in science itself. And in that process, there's a different level of othering. It's oftentimes state-based. It's promulgated by the elites. It's curated, it's used strategically. And so it's not just some person seeing another person that's different. It's actually, as I said, being weaponized for certain purposes. And we see this global trend happening. I was at a meeting the other day and they said there are only about 14 strong democracies left in the world out of over 200 countries. And so some of the things that are associated with this global trend are demographic change, technological and social media, globalization, income and wealth. And we very well could add ethnic nationalism or racism in the United States. So when we talk about othering, one question that becomes, what's the response to it? And here are possible responses. We promote equality as opposed to othering. We promote equity or inclusion, or equitable inclusion. And at the Othering and Belonging Institute, we promote belonging. We say that the solution to othering is not any of these other things, but actually belonging. And I'll come back to that shortly. Belonging has a different valence than even inclusion. Inclusion is more about joining something that's already there. It's like going to someone else's house or someone's city, and you go in as a guest. And that's better than being excluded. but you don't have full participation or full membership. So belonging is about co-creating the very thing you're joining. And this graph takes us back to what's in the film that hopefully you'll get a chance to see. And what this basically shows is that rapid change actually creates increased anxiety in almost all mammals, not just humans. But in humans, maybe unlike other mammals, we have a way of actually curating this anxiety. And there are two major ways, and it's done largely through leadership, meta-narrative structures, and organizing. One way is to take this anxiety and talk about it, tell stories about it in such a way that there's an other, sometimes a manufactured other, that's the cause of our anxiety, that this other is a threat. They're different than us. And the threat can be physical, the threat can be economical, the threat can be spiritual. The main point is that somehow they're different than us and they're a threat to who we are. That's called breaking. So literally creating fractures in society, breaking groups apart, and creating these hermetic seals, imaginary hermetic seals between groups. Another way of approaching is what's called bridging. And that is saying, okay, maybe people look different, maybe they talk different, but there's something about another person that actually ties us together. And that's bridging is done through telling stories about the other in such a way that it promotes compassion and empathy. Or it can also be arranging resources to promote compassion and empathy. And compassion is the root word of compassion means to suffer with, to listen to someone else's suffering, to engage someone else's. It doesn't mean you agree with them when you listen to their suffering. It means you acknowledge that they are suffering because of some condition, and you see them. So suffering that's seen, the recognition of suffering in others, as well as other emotions, but suffering is particularly strong, is one way we bridge, is one way we create empathy. And research on that shows that it's incredibly powerful. The flip side of othering is that we refuse to see the othering, the compassion in others. We flatten them. They don't become complex human beings. They become some caricature of a human being. Already suggested that the container we live in, whether it's a container of democracy, a container of our work, is cracked. And when the container is cracked, almost everyone feels other. No one feels this anxiety becomes endemic throughout the entire society. And so it creates the condition where, unless we're careful, we'll see a lot more breaking. Someone has to pay attention to the container. Someone has to actually figure out how to create something that holds all of us. And normally we don't think about these containers. They just do their work. When they're cracked or broken, someone needs to pay attention to them. One of the reasons that we promote belonging over equity is to promote belonging to, equity, how it's practiced in our society, actually promotes breaking. It promotes othering because it's oftentimes seen as competing for scarce resources. And so some other group is threatening your well-being by making claims to resources that your group feels like need. That's the way equity is practiced. And under such conditions, you have breaking and then groups actually fracturing even more. Equity in that context is actually seen as a zero-sum game. Some groups win and other groups lose. I talked a little bit about belonging being co-creating. So you're not being invited into an institution and as a quiet guest, you're actually coming in to co-create the very thing you're joining. And so as belonging unfolds, the institutions and structures that we belong to are constantly changing as we co-create. We co-create not just for ourselves, but for the institution and all people. What we're talking about here is belonging without othering. So sometimes we have belonging, I belong to a certain group, and it's predicated on some other group not belonging. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the circle of human concern where everyone, including Earth and other life expressions on the Earth, are all belong. How do we actually move in that direction? And that's a process that will probably never be completed, but it orients the way we live and the way we experience ourselves. So sometimes when we see structures and barriers, we think that the goal is to remove them. And that's not really the goal, that's an incomplete goal. Structures do work. So we're not trying to get structures to a neutral place, we're trying to get them to a proactive place where the structures are being co-created to support belonging. So to affirmatively organize structures and processes so they support belonging, not so they're neutral. I talked a little bit about bridging, and there's more than one way of thinking about bridging. Bridging can happen between individuals, and that's the primary way that people talk about bridging in the United States. But it also can happen between groups, and that's a different process than between individuals. It also can happen between institutions. And so there's these different levels and different ways of thinking about bridging. Again, most of the work in the United States, influenced by Robert Putnam, focuses on bridging at the individual level, which is not unimportant, but it doesn't address breaking at the group level. So breaking at the group level needs a different intervention than breaking at the individual level. And here you have two people. One of them is a bridge builder, a bridger, and one of them is not a bridge builder. One of them is going to burn the bridge down. And I know all of you are probably thinking, or some of you are thinking, about how can I participate in this? So one of the things we want to promote is that you become a bridge builder. You deliberately think about how do you bridge between different groups. And a friend of mine, Bell Hooks, reminds us that if you're a bridger, or bridges are made to walk on. So if you're building bridges, if you're a bridger, you're likely to be challenged. You may even be walked on, both by the group you're part of and the group you're reaching out to. So it's not easy work, but it's rewarding work and it's necessary work. So we need a new story, a story that there's a new we and a future where we all belong. And I'll close by just saying, open up to questions, that one of the roles of the library is not just a public space, but it's also a place, if you think about it, where we hold our collective stories. So how do we actually hold these stories, animate these stories in such a way that people not only tell about their own suffering, but they can hear and tell about others' suffering? That effort, when done well, is a powerful tool for creating belonging and addressing othering. So that's the end of my slides. And now I'll open it up for questions and comments before we go into break groups.
Thank you so much, Professor Powell, for your remarks and your thought leadership that you bring to us during these times. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Tyller Williamson, who's the Vice Mayor of the Monterey City Council, who will lead the question and answer session.
Hi, Tyler.
Hi, Professor Powell. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I am happy to see many familiar faces out there, and through some kind of virtual vibe world, I give you a hug, and I'm also giving a hug to those of you that I don't know, because I imagine that this is a very loving space and a good group of folks that we have here. And so I'll go right into my first question. Actually, before I do that too, if folks want to, thank you, Anita, I'm giving you a hug. If folks want to submit questions, I'll try to loop those into the questions that that I ask of Dr. Powell. But again, kind of noting that the folks in this room are probably some of the folks that are already doing some of the work, that may be already on a path of self-learning and growing. How can we give a message to these individuals to go out there and continue doing the work that they're doing, particularly getting the message to the folks in the community that probably need it the most in regards to understanding the needs of empathy and understanding people and their other position in which they come from?
Well, that's a great question, Tyler. So a couple of things. One, when we live our life largely in habits. In fact, the unconscious is called the habituated. The unconscious is deeply habituated. And the thing about habits, you don't have to think about them. So they make it easy to move through things. When you have to think about things, it feels awkward. You know, if you eat with your left hand and you switch to your right, it feels awkward. And we have habits are important. They sort of facilitate a movement through life without a lot of energy. And the brain is a sinkhole. It's about 6% weight and it uses about 20% of the body's energy. So it's looking for ways to cut down on energy. And habits is a good way to do that. So when we talk about bridging, we're talking about doing something that may be a little awkward, something that doesn't come naturally. We've settled into patterns where we tend to hang out with people who in many fashions may seem like us, both in terms of race, class, ethnicity, in terms of ability, in terms of religion. And so we talk about short and long bridges. Short bridges are bridges with people who are very similar to you, but there's still some stuff. Might be your family members. You love each other. You care about each other. You have similar goals oftentimes, but you still have friction. Those are called short bridges. Then there are what we call long bridges. Bridges where you think someone is like, they have very different goals than you. They don't maybe even worship the way that you do. And they may not like you. You may not like them. And chances are you don't see each other very often. You see each other through filters, whether it's through television or social media. So how do you, first of all, even find these people? And once you find them, what do you say to them? How do you come together? Oftentimes when we come together in this context, we come together to engage in some sort of public fight. We come together to sort of say, you're wrong and I'm right, you know? And so you have groups, and it can be across any axis, racial axis. So you have, you know, in the last summer, you had the Trump people and Black Lives Matter people coming together, not to bridge, but really to break, to sort of point the finger at each other, to talk about the others being wrong, and any issue like that. So part of the thing is, can we create space, containers, where we can come together to bridge? And again, the first instance of that is going to feel awkward. And we can do it at a small context, just at a dinner. There are restaurants in Israel, for example, that if Israeli comes in with the Palestinian, they give them a discount on food. They're saying, these two people don't actually come and eat together. You come and break bread together. We know that you're swimming upstream. So again, I want to suggest that the library might decide to consciously bring people together who comes from different walks of life. And some bridging can be more benign in the sense that I don't dislike someone, I just don't know them. So in our society, race tend to be a pretty sharp edge. Disability is an edge as well, but it's not quite as sharp because most of us have someone in our family who's disabled. Age can be a bridge. I mean, any number of things can be. And that's why I talk about othering being weaponized. It's not just that people are different, it's being organized as different. So, so again, how do you begin to think about and come together with people who are different? It's going to take a little extra work. It's going to be a little awkward. There's some things you can learn. There are belonging circles all around the country now. There are people who are trying. And again, in my mind, the ideal of the public library is to bring people together, not just for books, but to have some interaction with each other, have conversations, have, you know, stories, break bread. So I would think deliberately, what are some of the opportunities that you might use in Monterey County to bridge with people who may not look like you, may not worship like you, may not love like you?
I love the response to that. Already there's some thoughts running through my mind, but the idea about creating an incentive around it and understanding that the beginning of that is the challenge, is getting that going. But creating an incentive sounds like a good path forward. I do see a question in the chat, and so I'll ask a leading question and then read that question. If you could start off by telling us a little bit about the Othering and Belonging Institute, and then to follow up to that, Courtney said, I saw the Institute recently came out with a report about segregation in communities across the US. Could John say more about how othering has contributed to this and how things may have changed over time?
Thank you for the question, both questions. So I'll just say a little bit about the Institute. We are UC Berkeley. We have 7 clusters which are organized around themes and people. So there's a cluster on disability, there's a cluster on race, there's a cluster on gender, there's a cluster on religion. And then there are also themes like education, democracy, health. And what we try to do is sort of start by looking by shining a spotlight on groups who tend to be more marginalized. And each cluster has about 12 to 15 faculty members. And then we have a staff of about 50. So in total, we get close to 200 people who are doing original research, doing translation, helping cities, governments, nonprofits, for-profit companies sort of understand what these things might mean and look like in their environment. And the work has been, it's challenging, but it's quite rewarding. We work with unions, we have a big presence in parts of Europe, and scheduled to do a talk for groups in Africa and Asia. And so these issues, which is sort of interesting, when you think about race in the US context, it's a US phenomena, not exclusively, but primarily. When you go to South Africa, they still have their ways of othering at an institutional level, but it's not along race. It's along very different phenomena. And yet the practice, the results of being othering have some of the same effect. When you other people, both the people who are targets have a hard time fully expressing their humanity, fully relaxing. The nervous system at a group level, the trauma is widespread, and it distorts the dominant society as well. So it's like a multiple injury. And one of the ways that we other is how we organize structures and institutions. So segregation is a perfect expression of othering. You're saying to a group of people, not by words, but by the way you organize space. And think about schools when we said, think about colored drinking fountains. Not only is that an assault to someone trying to get water, it's an assault to their very being as a human being. It's saying you don't really belong in this group, in this society, or you only belong in a negative role. Or think about until very recently when we said 1920, women couldn't vote. We're saying by that action, we're defining women less than. We're saying, okay, you have a role, but it's a subservient role. It's a diminished role. And we're still really dealing with that at a conscious level, at an unconscious level, at a cultural level, and at a structural level. The way we organize space. Think about things like the American Disability Act, which basically talked about having ramps for people in a wheelchair. If you have a building without accessibility, you're saying that building is saying, this is not your place, go someplace else. So what we're doing with the segregation study is we're saying, let's look and see how these institutions are sorting people. It's interesting on a number of levels. It's not just sorting people, and the sorting is not just through phenotype, what you look like. It's also sorting resources. So we tend to direct resources toward one group and away from another group. And in a sense, space is a efficient way of doing that. Black communities, Latinx communities, Vietnamese communities, Native American, all those places tend to have less resources. And so when something like the pandemic happened, we noticed it moving through this structured space. So it distributed resources unequally, and we have unequal outcomes. The last thing I'll say on this for now, it doesn't just distribute stuff. The way we organize space and the way when we say someone belongs or doesn't belong, it also organizes identity. What does it mean to be Black in America? It means, so it's not that it's not just a phenotype, it's basically a social location. It's accorded or not accorded respect. So when you see someone of a different race, of a different ethnicity, or hear an accent, what happens to that person and to you? And so all of this is about othering and belonging and trying to figure out how to deal with these things at these multiple levels. And the earlier question you asked in Tyler in terms of what people can do. So people can do stuff in the individual capacity, but some of this stuff needs to be done at a leadership capacity, at an institutional capacity. I believe you're on the city or county council. So what sacred symbols do we recognize and not recognize? So there's a big fight now about Confederate monuments. That's making a statement about not only who belongs, about who does not belong as well.
There are so many connections here, and I see Sue's question in the chat, which I'll get to after I ask another question here. And we talked about this a little bit before we met today. The city of Monterey specifically has a population that's almost 80% white. But even looking at it from a larger regional perspective, the majority of the population is white, and this may not something that we see in more diverse communities where people feel like some of the real work can and should be done. And so, what does that mean for the opportunities in communities like ours on the peninsula, so that we can affect change and create belonging in this time of othering?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a complicated question. So first of all, there's no such thing as a homogeneous community. And we're not talking about just individual difference, we're talking about how groups are organized, right? So I already talked about women. So in that 80% white, you have women and men. You have people who are gay and straight, who are also white. You have people who are transgendered. So you already have a diverse community, and you have the sorting of people based on that. You have the sorting of people based on, for example, not just their race, although that's an important factor in the United States, but are they transgendered or not? Are they a woman or not? In the election cycle for president, some recent data suggested that 20% of Americans believe no woman is capable of being president. Not a white woman, not a Black woman, not an Asian woman, not a Native American woman. It's like, so that's gendered, right? And 20% of Americans, that's not saying whether that person is Democrat or Republican, liberal, conservative. Like the fact that they're a woman, for some people say they're not qualified, they're other, they're not qualified for that office. Maybe they can be a secretary, maybe they can be, so you're still dealing with that. Secondly, you think about the demographics of Monterey or any city, those demographics don't just happen. Why is it that some places we live in a very diverse state? There's no racial majority in California, and the racial plurality is Latino or Latinx. You have, and my guess would be of that 20% who are not white, a substantial number are Latinx, and the demographics are changing. So how do you affirmatively embrace that? How do you, what we've done in the past, and we're trying to get over this past, but we have to acknowledge it. This is what the segregation report is partially about. We organize space to make it hard for people who are not white to actually be in certain space. So I live in Berkeley, and one of the neighborhoods in Berkeley is called Elmwood. And Elmwood deliberately created single family housing to keep out Blacks and Asians. I mean, they were at the time, 1906, they didn't hide it. It's like, okay, what can we do to make sure they don't live here? Well, 100 years later, Elmwood is still disproportionately white, given the demographics of the Bay Area. And until recently, and they're talking about changing that now, they still have zoning, so you can only do single family housing. And it's still doing the work. The structure is doing the work. It's no longer anyone saying, let's keep out Blacks and Asians verbally, but the structure is continuing to do the work. And that's why I said, when we think about structures, it's not to remove barriers. It's how do we have structures do the positive work that we want them to do? If we want to have a more welcoming, a more belonging community, how do we organize structures to actually make that real? And I don't know enough about Monterey County uh, to give you very many concrete suggestions, but if you start looking for them, you'll see them. There are many. I mean, so for example, the bus service, the number one population that use public buses in the United States are Black women. So if you take away public buses, you just made a huge hit on Black women. You know, people might think buses, that's not, that's race neutral, gender neutral. There's almost nothing that's race neutral and gender neutral. One of my favorite examples is in the bad old days, we used to fly a lot, luggage racks. Think about luggage racks on a plane. Luggage racks up over your head, where you're lifting heavy luggage. So who might that negatively impact? Well, it turns out women as a group are shorter than men. Women as a group have less upper body strength than men. And this may sound controversial, but I think the data supports it. Women as a group carry more luggage than men. So it's like, so whoever designed those luggage racks, whether intentionally or not, just disadvantage women in terms of flying. So what women do for this structural problem that's a group level problem, they make individual interventions. What do I mean by that? So disproportionately, women check their luggage. And those of you who fly a lot know that when you check your luggage, first of all, you got to get there 45 minutes to an hour earlier. Then when everyone leaves the plane, you have another hour to pick up your luggage. And way too often your luggage is lost. Just think about that's a completely gendered phenomena without ever mentioning women. So what are those similar phenomena in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion? They're are not predicated based on someone being a racist or a bigot or something, but they're just predicated on keeping these same practices, single family houses, no bus service, luggage, that actually excluding people. Now, I'll just say one last thing. The heart of belonging is co-creation, which means you're listening to people and people are participating. Too often when we think about the racialized other, the people who are different, it's like, we don't know them, or maybe let's help them. The WHO contacted me at the height of the pandemic and said, how do we get the Black community to take the vaccine? First question I asked them is, have you talked to the Black community? Their response was, great idea. So exactly. So start with that. How do you actually, the population you want to be in relationship with, be in relationship with them, have them co-create, have them, what's on their mind? Are they present at your meetings? And if not, why not?
I was gonna, gosh, there's so much. I wish we had like hours to do this. When you were talking about women in luggage, the other thing that was on my mind was you're paying extra too to do the stowaway, right? So there's so many layers to it. And then there was another point that I was going to bring up just to kind of make it more relevant towards your hometown that you were speaking to in regards to Berkeley. We have something similar with Delray Oaks was carved out of Seaside to be a white-only community away from people of color in Seaside. So there's very much something that resonates, I think, with us on the peninsula here to your story. So I appreciate you sharing that. Okay, so I'm going to jump to Sue's question in the chat. Any ideas for how to build bridges with folks who are attacking critical race theory, which in reality is just the notion of telling the truth about systemic racism? How do we get to belonging?
Right, great question. So oftentimes, that slide I had of the guy trying to burn down the bridge, right? I mean, oftentimes I say to people, start with shorter bridges, that we have to exercise that muscle and get comfortable. Think about something like nonviolent communication, which is basically I statements and it's how do I feel? It's easier to strike back, right? Someone calls you a name, it's easier just to call them a name back. Someone hits you, it's easier to hit them back. I mean, it makes sense. That's very natural. Animals do that. A dog, a wolf bites one wolf, the other wolf bite back. They don't say, can we talk about what's going on? And bridging requires a skill. And so one of the things I would encourage you to think about is supporting people as bridge builders. And in that effort, I would not start with the most difficult situation. There's some people who you're never going to get. And I say, still hold on to their humanity. Even if they're, when Derek Chauvin was being sentenced, Keith Ellison, who's the Attorney General of Minnesota, was on national television. And someone said, he was being interviewed. And the interviewer said, aren't you happy that you finally got justice? And he said, first of all, this is not justice. This is a step in the right direction, but it's not justice because we're talking about a system, not just a person. But secondly, I feel kind of bad for Derek Chauvin. And the interview almost fell out of his seat. Keith Ellison's a Black man, Attorney General of Minnesota. Why do you care about this racist white guy? And he said, he's still a human being. And he's in pain. And so, and I'm not saying we shouldn't protect ourselves. We should. I'm not saying we should let people get away with murder. We should not. But we still have to hold on to their humanity. And the process of actually, and leaders play an oversized role. Remember when you talk about group breaking, you can't just deal with it at the individual level. And one reason is groups are predicated on, if you want to stay in good standing in this group, you got to hit that other group. And so your belonging in this group, Group A, is predicated on your being nasty to Group B. And we saw that, with Liz Cheney, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to actually engage maybe the truth around the election. It's like, okay, you're going to lose your position. Maybe you're not going to get a chance to be a Trump Republican anymore. What did she do? She tried to, anyway, my point is that I wouldn't start with the most difficult. So the people who are thinking about critical race theory, first of all, I listen to them. What are they saying? And then I would more than listen to them. I would try to, empathy is not just a head game, it's a heart game. What are people feeling? What are people afraid of? How are people suffering? And oftentimes we go to positions which seem intractable. You're against abortion, I'm for abortion. You're against immigration, I'm for immigration. And it's like, but in that dance, we don't see each other. What are you afraid of? What am I afraid of? And so the practice of bridging is a practice, and there's certain things we learn. And so, for example, I could see, I'm just throwing out this, Monterey County may say we're going to have some public events and we're going to practice bridging. We're going to have a session where people learn to bridge, learn to talk to people and listen to people who they don't agree with. And all of us have had people we don't agree with. Some of them we're married to, some of them are our children. But then we don't usually, maybe sometimes we do, but we don't usually get a divorce or kick our kids out of the family because we don't agree, because it's also held by love. And with the person who is attacking critical race theory, I don't know who that person is, but I probably don't love them. They're probably not in my inner circle. So I would try to create a space where I listened to them and saw them at a much deeper level, and hopefully they would afford me the same kind of standing.
There was this news story that came out recently about folks on both sides of the political aisle, that those that supported Trump and those that clearly didn't, and developing these groups at the local level to try to bridge gaps. And so they spend time listening to each other and trying to understand where each other are coming from. And at the end of the day, there's just things that they are not going to agree on, but they find space for that common ground and have those conversations. And so it definitely resonates with what I think you're saying, And I'm going to read Bob's comment too, because I think it all connects there. So he said, my landlord is such a nice guy, considerate, educated, fair with me as a tenant. He's also a Trumper, believes the big lie, etc., which I find so deplorable. Difficult to hold both aspects at once, makes me not want to have much contact with him. So, I mean, I think that experience probably resonates with a lot of us, maybe even family members. I appreciate you sharing those comments, Bob, and I'll let you, Professor Powell, I'll let you jump in and share any other thoughts with that, but I want to loop in another question here, and this may be the last one before we go into breakout rooms here for a little bit. But it makes me think about when you're talking about systems. So we hear a lot about tearing down systems and starting new. And so I wonder, what does that mean to you? How do you interpret that with the work that you're doing? And I think a clear example of that we see recently is with policing. Completely tear down the system, it's racist, and start new, which it's not fully clear what that might be sometimes, but what are your thoughts around that?
Well, the policing is something I've been directly involved in, and it won't surprise you that underneath that request is a lot, right? It's like it's hurt, it's trauma. It's like we don't believe this system can ever be repaired, so just tear it down. And what takes its place? And really, what people are oftentimes saying, we did a survey to try to get at the bottom of this. So it says tear it down. Let's why? Why do you want to tear it down? And it's like, well, they're not accountable. They don't respect us. They don't see us. They literally kill us. Okay, so what you want is respect. You want a respectful system. You want accountability. You want to be seen. Yes. Okay. Now, there's tremendous agreement on that from the right, left, conservative, and liberal. But people have different ideas about solutions, and people are situated differently. There's that picture of four guys carrying a king or queen or whatever, and the four guys doing the carrying say, wow, yeah, it's a tough road. The king and queen is like, this is a lovely walk we're on, because I'm sitting here and somebody's carrying me. So people are situated differently. And some of the work we do is try to get people to understand how they're, we used to have that saying, let walk a mile in my shoes before you judge me. We've forgotten that. And the other thing that you suggested, Tyler, I think is really important in this. It's not simply seeing our common humanity or our common ground, it's actually creating it. We can do things to create common experiences. And there are positive examples. For example, there was a small town in Northeast United States where a large immigrant community moved in, and it was like, they weren't Christians, they weren't white, and they were being completely ostracized. And as it turns out, what the kids from this community did, they played soccer. And they eventually took this city's soccer team all the way to a state championship. And the whole town came together. It's like, who'd have thought, So there's this new phenomena of soccer that they shared and they did together. So sometimes it is doing something together. And one of the most powerful examples of bridging in the country, which people sometimes don't like to be reminded of, is the US Army. It's the military, where you take young white boys from, disproportionately from Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, rural, with young Black boys from Detroit, Chicago, young Latinos from, Dallas, Los Angeles, and you throw them in a hole together and give them guns. It sounds like a horror movie, right? And yet out of that come lifelong friendships that none of them would have anticipated beforehand. And the Army took that on deliberately. It wasn't an accident. It didn't work out so well in the 60s. And they really thought about, how do you create essentially bridges? And so we have positive examples. The workplace is another. Unfortunately, there are not many places where we come together. So it's easy to hold caricatures of each other. It's easier to, you can hate up close, but it's harder to hate up close than it is at a distance. Unfortunately, we have way too much distance. And so You know, we've done some reports. I would encourage people to look at our some of our work on bridging. We know a fair amount. We don't know everything, but we're learning. So yeah, and again, if leaders give people both permission and encouragement to bridge, they're more likely to bridge. So if you can bring people together who can talk about their journey of learning to reconnect with each other's humanity. You know, there's a fairly famous person, rich person, billionaire, who talks about he's now funds gay rights. His son came out as gay. He kicked him out of the family, and they went through a long process of reconnecting, and the father, recognizing the son's humanity. And he eventually said, I recognized the problem wasn't with my son, the problem was with me. Well, that's powerful because he speaks to an audience that I don't normally speak to. Christian conservatives, white, male. So looking for those opportunities as well. And there are many across the country. They're not to scale. It's not nearly enough. We're still breaking more than we're bridging. And our leadership is not always in the right places. But we can and will necessarily do better.
That was great. So, and correct me if I'm wrong in a quick maybe yes or no. I want to make sure I give folks time to chat in their breakout rooms. But how I interpret what you were just sharing is it's not necessarily going to a place of tearing it down per se, but it's being able to listen to somebody that might be coming from a different perspective and understanding where they're coming from, and allowing that person, allowing you to understand where you're coming from, to find a way of building that bridge, to find a solution that helps the community move forward together.
That's exactly right. And most things are working for part of the population and not the other part of the population. And so be sensitive to that. So it's not a zero sum. It's not, even in the Black community, older Blacks tend to be more in favor of strengthening the police, not just disbanding them. And that's a shorter bridge because older Blacks and younger Blacks tend to have some shared common humanity they're in touch with. If you make it on racial terms, it's harder. If you say white people want the police, Black people don't, that's a harder discussion to have. But you're absolutely right. And so the complexity and nuance actually is a good thing. If we can stay in that complexity and nuance space, then there are fewer Black and white, there are fewer binaries. Things are to some good, to some bad. How do we actually minimize the bad and emphasize the good? And not just for us, because when belonging is about not creating a society for me or for you, but for all of us. This larger inclusive we. We're all part of that. We need to hear everybody.
That was well said. I wish we were almost ending there because that's like, it resonates very well for a walk away message. But I want to also allow you all to maybe allow this to initiate your conversations in the breakout room. So I'm hoping that everybody can stick around because I think this is an essential part, right? Like, let's start building this. I know that, again, a lot of you on this call are probably, you get it to a certain extent already, but we're all in our own learning space. And so, let's use this to go into breakout rooms and maybe better understand where other people are coming from, or maybe takeaways that you had for the discussion. It's for till. So I'm thinking, Francesca, if we maybe just allow till 5 after for the breakout rooms. And I'm thinking, I'm not sure if this is easy to do, so stop me if I'm going in a bad direction, but can we try maybe 3, max 4 per breakout room?
Yes, that's what we do have. So I'll go ahead and open the rooms.
Does help me think about it differently, because again, and I said this a couple of times throughout the session, like I feel like the people here already kind of get it, but we're all on our own paths, and there is space for all of us to learn and grow and approach things in a better way. And so it does cause me to think about, how have I approached and interacted with folks? And I mean, as you can imagine, I experience these kind of people with different views and perspectives, and from a political point of view. and it's challenging sometimes because I'm like, why don't you understand? I guess I need to be careful how I even approach it within my mind, because how good am I really doing at being able to understand what's caused them to think that in the first place, and is there something there that I can learn from them and the experience that they're coming from, and just having that empathy, I think, is just so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and finding, okay, where are the shared values to start the conversation? I really like that approach. Like, I mean, he's mentioned nonviolent communication, which, I mean, I teach it, but I don't necessarily practice it very well. It's like a constant, reminder of like, okay, it's not about blaming. It's about, or just building those bridges, building that connection, even though you're starting from maybe a really far distance in terms of your beliefs. You may find as you talk, as you just listen, this is my entry point, maybe, to talking with this person and finding some shared understanding.
Absolutely. We have 2 minutes left, and I just wanted to jump, see if anybody else wanted to throw a thought or two in.
And I just really quickly say, I'm so sorry that I was late and then distracted because I was driving and needing to get things done. I just found out about John yesterday, and I'm thrilled to know that UC has this program and that such a wonderful fan is leading it. So thank you. And the more opportunities to learn how to bridge, the better. Thank you for holding this program.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. Francesca, this makes me think, I feel like we should have like a follow-on where it's like a workshop and people can bring, like have them have a homework assignment before they come, and they can think of, an issue within the community or a relationship that they have, whatever, that where there's an opportunity to build a bridge. And I don't know how that would work because there's only one Dr. Powell, but it would be an interesting, I think, way of allowing people to get maybe a little bit more of a hands-on experience of real world experiences that they're going through.
I agree, Tyler, and we do have you, which is a close runner-up. And you can always send an email to all the participants asking if they're interested.
Yeah, I was going to mention Sue Paris. So with NCBI
That's a good point.
They've done these kinds of bringing together of people in a, using different terms, but the same concept, so I think it'd be really interesting to have that combined energy.
I love it. I think NCBI is actually a really good partner for an effort like that. And here are everybody's beautiful faces coming back into the room, the ones that stuck it out. JT. Well, it's good to see everybody back. I hope that, is anybody have a big aha moment that maybe came out of the breakout session that maybe you want to unmute and just share with us quickly?
I'd like to share something.
I love it. Absolutely.
Hi, everybody. Laurel Lee Alexander here. And I was thrilled to be in the breakout room with Caitlin and John. And one of the things I shared was that this book cast has been one of the most profound books that I've ever read. And part of it was I felt helpless. And so I asked John, well, actually, John was talking about bringing people together to be curious and read the book and discuss it and learn from each other is a wonderful thing. And so right before we came back to the main room, I said, I'm so glad, thank you for saying that, because that makes me feel more positive. It was a really positive way to look at it. So I feel less helpless now.
I love it. Thank you so much for sharing. And then I see Kate has her hand up. Kate, you want to go ahead and unmute?
Yeah, just aha, Tyler. I thought that was so interesting about belonging versus this fight for equity or inclusion, and how that is still othering, like that is still actually engaging in something that's more problematic. because it's setting people apart, and this concept of belonging that then goes right into building bridges. It actually, you asked if there was an aha moment. It felt like an aha moment in terms of, the work that we do, and coming from that perspective, that's what we're doing. We're engaging in, I don't know if you would say furthering belonging, but belonging versus othering, and this concept of inclusion and equity might not get us there.
Beautiful. I appreciate the takeaways that some have shared. We are getting close on time. And so I do want to end with Dr. Powell being able to maybe wrap us up with any last minute thoughts, comments that he has for us, but I'll kind of pair it with a question, which is if there's any maybe lessons for folks who want to find ways of approaching relationships, short bridges, longer bridges, any kind of takeaways for us as we walk away as a call to action.
Thank you. So just a couple of quick thoughts. Laurel actually mentioned one. Relationship is a lot of the work. And so even the fact that you're engaging on collectively reading a book and sharing with each other is no small thing. So if you think about the work around bridging in the United States, most of it took it traced back to Putnam's work, where he wrote a book called Bowling Alone. So think about that. So he's saying it's the aloneness that actually is the engine for a lot of the fractures in society, that people are going out on their own. People are literally bowling alone. And so reading together is the opposite of bowling alone. And I think one of the reasons that Laura might have felt hopeless is that what's called for more and more is the intimate, interpersonal work, but also collective work. And so I gave the example in our group is that, I recycle and compost and all that, but I feel like it has no impact on the fires in California. And so there's these big mammoth problems, and by myself, I feel largely powerless. But the point is, I shouldn't be by myself. I should be in relationship with others. And we're really bad at that. And I think doing that, not just in terms of fighting the fires, but also in terms of breaking bread, in terms of dancing, in terms of music, in terms of reading books, to sort of celebrate our common humanity. And think about belonging is so critical. I mean, there's just every study that's been done, when people are isolated, it's worse than smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. It's actually worse than hypertension and high blood pressure in terms of health. And literally, we come into the world attached to another human being. Not figuratively, but literally. And we're one of the most helpless mammals on the planet. A horse within a few days is running around, coat. No baby's running around in 2 days. We're dependent on community, and we've forgotten that. So I think anything you can do in terms of Monterey County, you're already doing something, right? Even with Isabel Wilkins' book, but to build on that and give yourself permission to make mistakes. It's not that the tech companies always say, fail fast and smartly, right? So be willing to take some chances. So I want to applaud you for at least stepping into the water and being willing to explore what you might do to create belonging. And it is different than equity in the way that equity is practiced. It's not about winners and losers, it's about everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. I do want to pass it to Francesca to maybe loop us back to maybe what the future holds in regards to future opportunities. But we were just, before I pass it to Francesca, we were chatting during the breakout rooms about this idea that popped in my head about the opportunity to have some kind of maybe workshop where folks can kind of maybe bring a real world idea or problem that they're experiencing, whether it be with a personal relationship or something larger within the community. And you can bring that and understand how to work through that in a better way. And so I don't know what that full idea looks like, but the idea came up of using NCBI, Sue. So, we might want to connect more on that, and we can maybe discuss that offline, but I'll pass it to Francesca before we close out.
I just want to, of course, extend our deep appreciation to Professor Powell. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, as always enlightening. Thank you to Tyller Williamson for being such a great supporter and joining and facilitating a number of actually library programs to connect and build and foster that relationship within our community. You will all receive an email once the recording is available, as well as a link to a survey. We really appreciate if you can take a moment to complete the survey. It's part of the grant project. We'll also include the link to a form. So if you'd like to, as far as Tyler's idea, it's fabulous, follow up a next step. There are many books of cast available. So if you'd like to join the community read, we have book discussions, one starting this Saturday at 11 a.m. and it will continue through July 24th. And we also on Tuesday at 3 p.m. You don't have to attend every one. We welcome you at any one. Thank you. That is all mine. I'll pass it back to John. And thank you again, Tyler and Professor Paul.
Well, thank you, Francesca, and thank the library and the county and the city and all of you who join and for the work you're doing. I think it's critical, not just for Monterey County, but for the whole country, if not the whole world. And some of the work can be fun. Just as a closing, 2 movies came out before the pandemic. We rented a movie theater. One was Black Panther, and we gave away tickets, and then we had a discussion. And it was probably 50-60% young Black men at that movie. And a lot of them said it was the first time they had been to a public event where it wasn't about a killing or someone being evicted, to really celebrate. And literally these 22-year-old young men, some of them cried that how seldom they had a chance to come together and celebrate. Then a month or so later, we did the same thing with A Wrinkle in Time. And now it was 70% of the audience were young teenage girls. And it was just contagious to be in a movie theater with 800 people where 70% of them were teenage girls. But again, it was a small thing, but it really helped in terms of people coming together and engaging in activity that in fact was fun. So anyway, however you do it, I hope you will continue to explore some of those things as well. And it was great to spend time with you. And Francesca, always great to see you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to the Othering and Belonging Institute. Thank you to the Community Foundation for Monterey County, the California Library Association, Whites for Racial Equity, and to many other ally organizations, National Coalition Building Institute. You're welcome if you'd like to unmute yourself on your way out when you say goodbye. It's always fun to have this cascade of voices and images if you'd like. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody for being here. I'm so happy to see so many beautiful faces. Thank you, Dr. Powell. You're such a blessing. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, this pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I look forward to meeting you in person one of these days. That's one of my life goals. I'm going to add that to my bucket list.
All right. I look forward to that as well.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.